Okay, hello. I'm Lisa Bickmore, Poet Laureate of the state of Utah, and I want to welcome you to this session of the Utah Poetry Festival for 2023, Poetry as Activism. Before I introduce our moderator for this panel, Kara Van de Graaf, I want to acknowledge and give thanks to Utah Humanities and the Division of Arts and Museums who have provided funding and support for this festival. And also thanks to Salt Lake County Zoo Arts and Parks for their underwriting of arts and humanities activities, including this festival. I personally want to thank Laura Stott-Rogers, Nancy Takas, Michael Lavers, Kara Van de Graaf, Cindy King, and Daniel Dubrasky, who have been planners and organizers of this festival with me. And special thanks to Emily Grubby of Utah Humanities, who has provided the technical power and know-how behind this program. Without the efforts of all of these agencies and people, this festival would not be possible. I'll just note that we may have time to take questions, so please feel free to ask questions using the Q&A function, and Kara will nudge you about this too. I'll step back in to facilitate any last questions and to conclude the session at the very end. So let me introduce Kara Van de Graaf to you, who is right before you on the screen. She is the author of a book of poems, Spitting Image, which won the Crab Orchard First Book Prize. Her poems have appeared in the New England Review, Southern Review, the Adroit Journal, Agni, and elsewhere. She's an associate professor of English at Utah Valley University. Okay, Kara, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Beautiful. Thank you so much, Lisa. And I think I'm so excited to see so many people joining us as attendees for this panel. I think we're going to have a great time here in the next 45 minutes. Thank you, Lisa, for introducing me. I'm going to be the kind of person on this panel who prompts people with questions, or who kind of organizes things and makes sure that questions you have might get addressed by this body of fabulous writers. But before we get going, I'd love for you to know who you're interacting with today. And we've got 4 amazing panelists who are here to talk about this, and I'd love for them to introduce themselves. And Maddie, would you mind kicking us off and just saying a little bit about who you are to these folks?
Sure. My name is Maddie Lane Glasgow. I am currently a PhD candidate at the University of Utah. I've been coordinating our Wasatch Writers in the Schools program there since 2019 that works with Glendale Middle School, East High, and most recently in the Utah State Prison.
Fabulous. Okay. Ashley, can you jump in now?
Hi, I'm Ashley Finley, and I love poetry and have done a lot of work as just teaching poet, slam poet, narrative strategist, all of that. So nice to be here. Thank you for having me.
Fabulous. Brock?
I got to get used to Zoom here. Hi, everyone. Brock Jones. I'm an assistant professor of literature and creative writing at Utah Valley University. I attended the University of Utah prior to coming to UVU, and my book Cenotaph was published in 2016 by University of Arkansas Press, a collection of poems based somewhat autobiographically and somewhat not, I don't know if that even makes sense, on my experiences in Iraq and Afghanistan over the last 15 or so years. I'm just excited to be here.
Thank you. And finally, Joel.
I had to step away to try to quiet the dogs who are in the backyard barking. I'm Joel Long. I'm a poet, author of 3 books of poems, Winged Insects, Knowing Time by Light, and Lessons in Disappearance. I teach high school English and creative writing at Rowland Hall, St. Mark's, and for about 22 years, I've been running this city art reading series at the Salt Lake City Public Library.
Thank you. All right, here are our intrepid panelists. And, when we were talking about putting panels together for the Poetry Festival this year, one of the things that came up is thinking about poetry as an activist space, a space where the writing that we do, the reading of the writing that we do, the performance of the writing that we do can go out into the world and maybe make change or affect change or represent experience that maybe isn't being represented. And I think it'll be really interesting before we fully kick into this for us just to talk about as a group of people, because our writing backgrounds are super different, actually. What it means to write a poem that we would define as an activist poem. And what does that little contraption have to do? And is there a difference between a poem that's specifically or explicitly activist and just a poem that is maybe responding to the larger political climate? Or I don't know if there is a difference between those things. So I'm really curious, in your own work, in your own readership as people who are writers and very invested in poetry, how do you think about what an activist poem is? I don't know, anybody?
No one wants to start. I'll start because I don't know if ambivalent is the right word for it, but I think that writing an activist poem sounds like a dangerous possibility. I think as a writer, we sort of fear that. We fear, stepping out and saying something that is political activism in a poem because we want the poem to do the job of art. And, obviously we're all, sensitive humans to the world. We're sensitive to injustice. We're sensitive to grief. We're sensitive to terror. And as poets, we respond, and we respond in language. I think that if we say, I'm going to write the activist poem, that language can sometimes feel manipulative. So I'm going to start out by saying that it is fraught with dangers. And I think to write a good activist poem is to write a good poem that doesn't necessarily play its hand in that manner.
Yeah, I really like that perspective. I think that this question kind of threw me when I read it, in the preparation, because I was like, what does it mean to write an activist poem? And I think about, the activists who I admire, who I learned from, and the writers who I admire, learn from, I would say I'm in the tradition of Nikki Giovanni, Maya Angelou, James Baldwin, Zora Neale Hurston, all of these amazing thinkers, writers, storytellers, who did, I think, the work of what we would call activism, right? What we recognize as activism. But what really stands out to me is that, really what they were was storytellers in the tradition of Black storytelling, right? But also were truth tellers. One thing about a Zora Neale Hurston or a James Baldwin is you're gonna get the truth, and you're gonna get the truth as they see it, right? And so I think activism in general, but activism through art, if nothing else, it has to tell the truth, right? And we have to see the glimpse of what life is like, because what I also love about these writers, thinkers, educators, whatever we call them, right, change makers, is that they're telling stories that we can relate to even now, so many years later, across different demographics, but they're telling them through their own lens, right, and their own experience. And so I think the most impactful poetry and art as activism tells the truth about the life that the artist is living, right? And that's through that, right? That's the power of storytelling. So through that, then, change happens.
Can I jump in? Sorry, Maddie, if I'm jumping over you. I think something that really rang true here was that the life that the artist is living. I've been thinking about a book called Doomstead Days by Brian Tier, and I listened to him on a podcast. I think it was called Edge Effects, and he was talking about bioregional literacy, being of a place and in a place and knowing that place so well. writing about, he was specifically thinking about ecological disaster from the hyper local. And it seems that like the idea that the life that the artist is living is exactly what I would characterize as an activist poem, because it seems a very radical act in my mind to do that work, to do that, and to put it out there for other people to encounter, a slow ecological disaster happening, right here, right now, for me, for this body and this mind, and so that really moved me when that was said. And I think that is, if I were to categorize my own poems that I might think of as activist, they are focused on, I think, they are hyper focused on not only my own experience, I guess, but on a place, on a time. I write a lot about war experience, and it's always I think very from like not the grand political picture, but the tiny disasters that reflect the grand political disasters.
Yeah, I just want to echo what everyone has said. I think everyone's spoken really beautifully about it. When I think of poetry more generally, like I'm always thinking about, I'm drawn to poems that create feeling and like try to complicate how we think about empathy, and even like a critical empathy. And I think that type of work generally like leads itself to potentially being an activist poem. But like Joel, I'm a little like trepidatious of using that term, just because of the ways like activist poetry or political poetry has kind of been assigned to different writers like throughout history. I think everyone in this group would use them as very positive words, like work that needs to be done, but that's not always the case in certain spaces for learning and art, especially academia, although I think it's changing in many academic spaces to kind of broadening what we consider good poetry, which I know is a question that's coming up. And in my own practice, I probably would try to refrain from identifying a poem as activist or not, but maybe the poems where I'm speaking about deeply personal experiences that have something to do with the social landscape that should be changed. In my first book, I wrote a lot about like queer suicide and like self-harm, and like how the structures we have in place are impacting those lives and my own. And I think like when you're able to identify your own positionality in a poem, like within a greater like problem that you're not trying to solve, but just address, we can kind of move towards a shared understanding and a community building that would hopefully like gesture towards action or change.
That's so interesting, Maddie, because I feel like part of what I heard you say is that traditionally your sense is that activist poetry and like high art, moving, beautiful poetry have been kind of separate things in our cultural imagination. Like the more activist the agenda of the poem, the less it kind of qualifies as art, maybe, and it gets something closer to like public speech, right? Or like kind of more civic work rather than art. I don't think I'd thought about that before. We definitely encourage people who are attending and thinking about this along with us. If you want to post something in the Q&A that you feel like, oh, this is another angle that maybe we kind of haven't addressed, please feel free to do that. I feel like we're going to be super informal because nobody has the corner on this market, right? We're all kind of thinking this through together about a space that's important to us. So please feel free to kind of jump in there. And, as everyone was talking, I was thinking about this graduate seminar I was in ages ago, because I'm 100 now, and it was about poetry and politics. And we were reading this anthology called Poets Against the War. I don't know if anybody remembers this. It's probably published in the 90s now, or I bet it. And I remember my professor holding up this book and kind of going, a lot of those poems kind of suck, don't they? It's a funny anecdote that I remember. And if any of you had a poem in Poets Against the War, sorry, I'm not talking about your poem. But I do think that it kind of raises a craft issue that Joel's comment and that kicked us off initially raises, which is that if we're trying to do this work that's activist, often it means maybe we're trying to shed light on something, or we're trying to, shape a conversation about something, or increase empathy about something, or maybe we're even trying to teach people something from a certain angle. But I think even though probably those of us on this panel don't necessarily agree with, that this specter of what Maddie raised, like, okay, activism is over here, poems are over here. I think as artists, as people who write, as people who read poems, as I suspect many folks listening also identify, we do have to contend with the fact that when you start to feel those fingers in the poem, trying to get at something, my sense is that as a reader, I often try to resist that. I'm like, oh, no. Like, don't come in here trying to teach me something in your poem. So there is an art to this, right? Like if we are people who believe that poems go out into the world and can affect change, we have to contend as craftspeople at a basic level with how we don't alienate an audience, especially potentially an audience who's not super friendly maybe to the point of view we have. So I'm really curious how you think about that in your own work, and and we can do it from a really practical kind of way. I imagine there's people sitting here listening who are like, this is important to me. I want to write something like this. What do you think about from a craft perspective when you're trying to write a poem about something that's important to you, about your lived experience or the world happening around you, but you don't want to have that kind of feeling conveyed to your readers that might alienate them from what you're trying to do?
I mean, sorry, is it okay? Wait, was someone else gonna go? You could go if you want to go. I don't have to go.
You go. You're on.
Okay. I was gonna say, I mean, that's such an interesting question because I don't think that I ever think about that in my own personal work and craft. I think that I move right in the praxis that like stories are valid, right? And my story is valid, and so is my life experience as, who I am, all of the intersectionalities I inhabit, right? And so I think that I have moved beyond, because I feel like, especially when you're a poet or artist or whoever is like writing for publication, or maybe you're writing as a performance poet or reading or whatever, right? There is that idea of like, is this good, or will this have the impact that I want? And I think that's a different question, right? Like, will this have the impact is different than like, will I alienate people with this, or will I make them feel like, will I disconnect them from my work, right? To be quite frank, I don't care, like, if I alienate or disconnect people from my work, because I think that there's a lot of different answers about why that might happen, right? But I think that stories find their people, and I think that the work finds its people, right? And so I just write and I just tell the truth. And sometimes it's not even about, like, a lot of the people in the community will know that like I write a whole bunch of Black shit, right? Like, excuse my language, but that's it, because that's my lived experience as a Black woman living on colonized land, right? But it's not like every poem I write is going to be about police brutality or, like being the descendant of enslaved people. Like, you're not going to necessarily read that in the words, but what you are going to read is what it feels like, to eat fried catfish and cornbread and have like that ancestral connection, right? What you are going to read is what it feels like to be in love with a Black man and sometimes worry about what it means for him to leave the house alone and me to leave the house alone, right? And you're going to get a glimpse into what it looks like to to look in our kitchen and our living room and see how we interact with each other, how I interact with my TTs and my uncles and my big mama, you know, like, so I don't necessarily think that, and because I approach the work that way, I don't ever really care about who's alienated by it, because I know that there will be people who find beauty in those stories. And then there will be people who don't. And some of those people just are committed to not, right? Because they see a work of art made by a Black woman and already have something in their mind about what that means. And so maybe eventually it'll come around to them, but if not, that's okay too. Like, the work finds who it's supposed to find.
Yeah, I'm really responding to that because I feel like Ashley is sort of moving the bar of what activism means, that maybe sometimes like just speaking something into the world can be activist, and it's not. I think, you know, if we're thinking about being persuasive, moving people from one position to another position, that to me seems like a slightly different thing than what you were saying, right? You're like, I want to represent my experience, and representing my experience can be activist in a certain lens. I don't know. Any other thoughts about that?
When I talk about writing process in general to my students, I start with the notion that writing is discovery. And so, you know, part of the danger, I think, of the activist poem is having the thesis to begin with and then imposing the thesis. So when Ashley was talking about alienating the audience, not necessarily with the experience that happens in the poem, but with, I've got this idea and I've come here to tell you the idea and you must believe this idea at the end of the poem. And so I guess when I write a poem, whether it's activist or not, I want my process to be discovering what that poem means. And if I'm doing that on a subject matter that might be political, might be climate, right? I've been writing a lot about the Great Salt Lake, both in prose and poetry over the last couple of years. I start with the idea that I'm going to tell that story, and I'm going to embody that story with the experiences that I've had at the lake, with the smells, with all those avocets that are lining the causeway this morning and everything else. That's where I started. And the idea is, if there's activism in it, I have to start with the metaphor of that physical thing that I confront. And for me, if I'm going to end up writing, I hope, a good poem like that, that's where the power is going to come. And that's where my discovery is going to come.
I guess I can add a little bit. I'm always interested in, especially in these types of poems where we're trying to potentially, or maybe not trying, but the end goal might affect change, is how we use like the you, or break that wall between speaker and poet and audience. Tarfia Fezullah has her first collection is called Seam, and she addresses this really well with her interviewer's notes. She's interviewed a lot of women who were affected by violence in Bangladesh, and also kind of turns the question of like, but wasn't it the neat narrative you wanted? So thinking about our own like desires and what we want out of a narrative when we approach this kind of work, and even that you kind of working in multiple ways of not only the reader of the book, but the you herself of the interviewer who is writing these poems through that process. And so that's one thing I always try to keep an eye on, is how whoever the speaker of the poem is, how I'm implicated in that. And if I'm making that clear in the poem, if I'm questioning it. I think one thing that often happens with the kind of poems we're talking about that are making an argument is they can be overly didactic or overly simplified. And I think a poem that embraces kind of tonal multiplicity, or just a multiplicity of possibilities and ideas within that problem that might be being addressed, can often kind of potentially reach more readers, but also embrace the complexity of a lot of the issues that we are trying to work through and address.
I'll just jump in real quick and say something about just very practical that I find useful. I think having people who can read, that you trust to read your poems as they are working their way through the drafting process, just to not so much for like critique, but so that so that I understand how a poem is enacting its magic or whatever, or not, on someone, right? So that if I am being overly didactic, as Maddie talked about, and I don't want to be, then they can help me, these having a small kind of group of people who with whom you share work and read each other's work, and describe how each other's poems are working on each other, I think is a very practical and useful thing, because sometimes maybe I do want to come off as didactic, and sometimes I want it to be subtle. And so having people who can read and describe the action of the poem to you can be a very helpful thing, I think. And that's just me adding a little bit of practical thinking to the answer.
We have some awesome questions in the Q&A, and I would love to sort of switch gears in that direction at this point. And Mindy asks in the chat if any of us have witnessed a moment when a poem or a movement has made a real difference. And it might be kind of fun to see if we can recall poems where they have had real impact, either on us, on people around us. I think, we can kind of, I know it's so weird on Zoom. I feel like if you feel like moved to jump in on these, please jump in. And if we feel like we've exhausted the conversation, let's just move forward and look at some of these other really interesting things, just for the sake of time. Yeah. So anybody like thinking about a moment where a poem has made a real difference, like maybe in the larger poetry community, maybe in a more local way, however you interpret that.
Yeah. Yeah. Is it okay if I go? Okay. I was gonna say, one instance that I can think of, just being in the performance poet, starting out as a slam poet, was, I'll be honest, I don't know who coined this like form of poem, like on the slam poetry scene, right? But many years ago, once slam poetry started becoming really popular, and then button poetry popped up on like YouTube and the National Poetry Slam and all of that stuff, like it was getting traction, right? Someone wrote at the time, it was just like, holy crap, and it was called Letter to My Abuser, right? And so now, if you pay attention to performance poetry or slam poetry, poetry like on stage, right? Like you'll see a lot of these kinds of poems, and like Letter to My Abuser, letter to whoever, but like this idea of addressing directly the person who caused harm in a very cathartic way kind of took fire. And so I would say that that's the first example that came to mind. I don't know who did it first. I don't know. I think I think it probably popped up on the National Poetry Slam stage somewhere way back in like the early 2000s. And people were really, really moved by that. And were really validated by hearing this like extremely vulnerable moment, right? Of this person like laying it out on the stage about like what happened to them and who did it, right? And like how, and like this beautiful moment of like saying like, yes, you did this thing, and of course there's all of these implications about what that thing is, but here's like, I need you to know, right? And this person also understands that like it's going to get back to their abuser, right? Like, so I think like we can get into like whether or not like that kind of poem, especially in the slam scene, is like overdone or not, but I will say that the impact it had in empowering people who have experienced abuse in whatever facet was incredible. And even still, like, even if I'm like, oh, here goes another letter to someone's abuser, you know, like in terms of like, you know, being in the space in a slam and having heard these kinds of poems a lot, I will say that still it like makes the hairs on my body raise to think of how powerful it is for a person to get their voice back. Right. And like also know that this is a space where they can get their voice back and, oh, I'm so sorry. And say like, no, you're not going to be able to get away from this. You're going to listen to me, you know, and I'm going to be empowered in this story. So that would be one example that I can think of off the top.
Anyone else feeling like a compelling example is popping up in their brain?
Can I respond to Ashley about, you know, maybe many poems that are letters to abusers? I think, thank God we have poetry, and I think we need to tell as many stories as we need to tell. And I don't even care how good they are. The art of poetry, the art of storytelling is necessary. And I think that, I mean, this is one of the things I was thinking about for this activism panel is like, if we feel the necessity to tell the story, we tell the story and we use the best means possible. And if it needs to be told over and over again, everyone is distinct and the language is going to matter. The phrase that comes to mind is right at the bone, right at the bone. You got to tell that story.
I feel like when I was, just before I started I feel like Claudia Rankin Citizen did a lot of work both like within academia and the way we are like speaking and interacting with one another, but obviously addressing violence towards Black bodies. And that was a collection that I think was quite formative for me and many of the people in the spaces I've shared to talk about poetry more recently. I think it was like 2014 or so.
Yeah, it's an interesting example because it's kind of like a book length work in a way. It's I don't think of the poems in that book as discrete, even though there's kind of chapters. And so I think that that's a great example from recent contemporary literary history. Of course, there are many more, right? Like I think probably we could all pick out like poems that sort of cropped up and represented, became kind of an anthem for something at a certain point. Yes, Citizen by Claudia Rankin is the book that Maddie is talking about. I'm just answering Lisa here in the chat. Beautiful. I love this. Okay, we have some more stuff here in the chat. I almost wish you could read this out loud for yourself. Okay, Nain Christopherson says, I recently read Jude Jordan's essay, For the Sake of a People's Poetry, where she talks about the splendid deficiencies of what we might think of as activist poems, including the quality of being, quote, readily comprehensible to the masses, end quote. When we think about writing the truth, where do you come down on the question of opacity and the artistic instinct to open up multiple interpretations, the critical pressure to be complex versus transparent or accessible, to be more easily understood by the people, as Jordan puts it? I mean, yeah, I feel like this is very along the lines of the conversation that we opened up earlier. But I think this kind of puts a finer point on it. Like accessibility is one need of an activist poem, because if it's not accessible, then it's unlikely to be doing much activist work. But then again, there's this artistic sense of multiple interpretation, hold up to criticism. What's more important? How do you think about that as writers?
I'll just jump in real fast and say that this is such an interesting question, because in my own work, I do seek a kind of subtle complexity, I guess. But in work of a lot of poets I teach, especially when teaching eco poetry and eco criticism, a lot of the authors that I think about who are doing that work are not what I would consider to be super accessible. So if we're thinking about work by, say, Brian Tier, Forrest Gander, Juliana Spar, these kind of people who are doing this kind of eco-critical work, I think think they are, I don't want to speak for them, but it feels as if they are embracing the complexity of the issue by not seeking to be overly super accessible for the masses. And the first poetry that I ever loved was super the super accessible, what one might consider to be however one might consider those terms, accessibility. But as I've sort of thought through the eco-poetic, and while there are some really great poems that are meant to be be read by anyone, really, some of the more interesting, or at least for me more interesting, eco-poetic work are not easily categorized and are not easily sort of maybe not easily grasped with a single maybe reading. And so I don't really have a great answer for that question that was posed, but I do find it an interesting topic to think about in terms of like, do activist poems need to be understood by a large group of people to be considered activist, or are we okay with kind of bucking against that? I don't have an answer, but it makes my mind, start churning and thinking deeply about the idea of activism as accessible work. I look forward to hearing what others have to say about it.
Maybe one more person can kind of chime in before we move forward.
I'll chime in. I always feel lucky that in my poetry tastes, my musical tastes, my tastes in art, that it's a broad spectrum. I like really, really complex poems like Jory Graham, but I love Mary Oliver. And I think you need that broad range. And, some people are going to be able to read. I can give Mary Oliver to my neighbor right now, and she could read it and be moved by it. If I give her Jory Graham, it's going to take a few days, but she may do it anyway. But I think it's great to have that broad range of tastes and to be able to celebrate that broad range. And, my neighbor might be moved to act by that poem. Somebody else might read that Forrest Gander poem and be moved by that and delve into that complexity and really enjoy it. So I say broad range. Let's go.
Yeah, that we need kind of like representation along that spectrum. So maybe don't worry too much about it. Who does an amazing job with this, I think, as a poet is Jamal May. And he's got this poem, There Are Birds Here, about his home city, Detroit. And you can Google this. I can't find a way to put a link in here, but if you Google There Are Birds Here, Jamal May, you're going to find it on the Poetry Foundation. And that is something I would define as an activist poem that is complex, but also accessible at a certain level. I really think he's an interesting person to look at for this balance. I want to get to a couple more questions.
Let me chime in for a sec. I had his poem, The Gun Joke, up as part of what I was thinking about for the discussion, because I think that's an amazing activist poem, but it's a great poem too. So it exemplifies the things we were talking about earlier, having all the craft that you're going to love in a good poem, but also, man, it has an impact.
Yeah, I think it's very interesting that we were both thinking about the same writer in response to that. So, okay, I'm so into this question, Lynn Domina. I'm so intrigued to hear what people are going to say about this. Panelists have been discussing the relationships among writer and audience and whether our work can or should or does change readers' minds. Have you ever written something that changed your own mind?
I don't want to be the first one again, but I'll jump. I'll take it. Yes. And I honestly, I feel like poems for me that feel that I write, that I feel most kind of I don't know, that I like most are those that surprised me in some way, that I didn't know what I was even really, I mean, maybe I knew what I was getting at, but how I'm going to do it or what it turns into. There's a great essay, some notes on organic form, I think it's called, who, I can't think of the name of is it Denise Liebertoff, I think?
It's not the Mary Ruefle book. That's not what you're talking about.
It's just an essay. Sorry, I don't have the name in front of me, but she talks about writing as sort of organic and just sort of being in the space and the poem sort of coming through you, but not necessarily from you. And it's kind of an interesting way of thinking about poems. If poems, I think I know what I'm going to say when I set out to write a poem on some days, and then other days I just feel compelled to write, and things kind of happen. I think Billy Collins talked about it as being like poems of the will versus poems of the imagination. And though I'm not really sure whether those are two, distinctive things, I think there is something to be said for like allowing language to work some kind of magic even in the creator of the poem. And so yes, I have been surprised and my mind has been changed. I don't know that it's been changed on any significant, political issues or ideas but it's been changed in what I thought the poem was and what it ends up being. My mind has been changed in those ways.
I mean, I can briefly say, I guess my mind has been changed, but I also don't know if it's on like an activist level. Like I've been writing a lot about bears and Timothy Treadway. And when I started, I like hated Timothy Treadway, but now I'm like, no, I should have more compassion because he was also a lonely man. So I mean, that's perhaps not the serious level of commentary, but I do think when we're spending a lot of time maybe with an individual or a topic, I've noticed like in working in sequences or in a single poem that oftentimes like by the time I'm done, it is a very different poem, or at least my mind has softened some and not been quite as cynical as maybe when I started the project.
But maybe, Maddie, that's one of the takeaways from our conversation today. Like it's very easy to enter into a panel on poetry and activism and be like, okay, I'm going to convince this person who, is racist to not be racist. That is probably not a move that takes place over one poem. But I think, in thinking about what you said, maybe the small changes are activism. Like maybe that's what really we mean by activism, that one moment where we understand the interior of another human being is an activist moment. And that I think is a special thing about poems. I'm always talking to my students about this, that there are so few places that we have in our lives where we get to use language to try and capture something that really can't be captured in language, but it's our interior experience of the world. And to me, that's a profound thing. And maybe like, I don't know, maybe just every time we get there with another human being, there's some kind of activist moment that's happening, whether it's about something we think about as activists in our brains ahead of time or not. And I feel good that we're ending right on time here with that like fist pump moment where I'm feeling good about the world and what poems can do. And I hope you are too. I know that anybody on this panel with us would be happy to hear from anyone who attended. So please feel free to look us up or contact us or respond to us if we didn't get to your question or something that maybe you were thinking that you wanted to share with us. And we're so grateful to those of you who came and decided to spend part of your Saturday talking about poetry and activism with us. Thank you.
Thank you, Tara.
Tara
and Lisa.
Let me just say, sorry. Sorry.
Yeah, please. I said thank you, Lisa.
I just want to say thanks to all of our panelists for this really, really stimulating conversation. I took a billion notes and I'm going to read some things. And then I also want to encourage all of you who attended, and thank you also for your attending and for your great questions, to come to our next session, which starts at 2. It's writing across languages, and I'm so excited about this panel. And I think that conversation should also be revelatory. So please come. Thank you. Have a nice little break before 2 o'clock.
Thank y'all so much.
Thank you all for
Thank
meeting.